The air was so cold it felt like breathing shards of glass. Below us, the Ardennes was a tangled graveyard of white and gray, a frozen hell where the trees snapped like toothpicks under the weight of the ice. But up there, 6 miles above the mud and the frozen blood of the 2nd Infantry, something impossible was happening. I heard the scream of the Junkers 88s first, engines straining, coughing, and dying in the thin, starved air of the stratosphere. Then I saw it. A sliver of polished wood and twin Merlin engines, slicing through the sky like a ghost made of moonlight. January 1944, just outside a nameless ridge near the Belgian border. The Germans were desperate, throwing everything they had into the clouds, and we were just down in the dirt, praying for a sign that the sky still belonged to us. The manuals they handed us back at Fort Dix said the sky belonged to the metal birds. They told us that the future of war was steel, aluminum, and heavy rivets. They said wood was for crates, for rifle stocks, and for the coffins they'd bury us in if we weren't careful. But that day, looking through my binoculars with fingers so numb I couldn't feel the brass casing, I realized every word in those manuals was a lie. The de Havilland Mosquito shouldn't have been there. It shouldn't have been able to outrun the best interceptors the Luftwaffe had left, especially not while carrying nothing but cameras and a couple of brave souls in a cockpit made of birch and balsa. We were pinned down by a nesting pair of MG-42s, waiting for an artillery strike that never came. We were looking for a miracle, and it appeared 40,000 feet above our heads. What I saw in the next 10 minutes changed the way I thought about the war, about survival, and about the things we build to keep the darkness at bay. It wasn't about who had the thickest armor. It was about who could fly where the air ends and the stars begin. I remember the smell of that morning clearly. It wasn't just the cordite from the morning's skirmish or the wet, rotting wool of my overcoat. It was the smell of ozone and frozen pine. We'd been moving for 3 days straight, silver thaw coating everything in a layer of ice that made the world look like it was made of glass. I was a sergeant then, responsible for a squad of boys who looked like they hadn't started shaving yet. There was Specs Moretti, a kid from Philly who could fix a radio with a piece of gum and a prayer. There was Tiny Henderson, 6'4" of pure Kansas muscle, carrying a bar like it was a toy. And then there was Miller, our oldest hand, a man who had seen enough of the Great War to know that silence was usually followed by a funeral. We were crouched in a shallow depression, the snow seeping through our trousers and leaching the heat right out of our bones. The Germans had a high-altitude recon habit that drove our brass crazy. They thought they were untouchable up there, but the British had sent over these wooden birds, these mosquitoes, and they were doing things that defied logic. I watched through the lenses, my breath clouding the glass. 2 Me-109s were banking hard, their contrails looping like white ribbons against the deep dark blue of the high altitude. They were chasing a single mosquito. It looked like a hawk being pursued by 2 angry hornets. The German pilots were redlining their engines, black smoke puffing from their exhausts as they tried to climb. But the mosquito just kept rising. It didn't bank. It didn't dive. It just climbed until it was a speck of dust in the eye of God. Before the war, I spent my days in a small shop in Brooklyn, working alongside my father. We weren't making weapons back then. We were making fine furniture, mahogany tables, oak cabinets, and delicate birch inlay. My father used to run his hand over a piece of seasoned wood and tell me that if you treated it right, wood was stronger than any metal. He said wood had a soul because it was once alive. Metal was cold, he'd say. Metal forgot where it came from, but wood remembered the wind and the rain. When I first heard about the Mosquito, a plane made of plywood and glue, I laughed just like everyone else. I thought the Brits had finally lost their minds. I pictured a kite with an engine, but standing there in the snow, watching those German fighters stall out and fall back toward the earth because they couldn't breathe the thin air at 40,000 feet, I realized my father was right. That wooden bird was alive, and it was mocking the very laws of gravity. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten. The sound of the German engines failing was a rhythmic, mechanical coughing, a series of pops and stutters that echoed down through the valley. It's a sound you never forget, the sound of a machine giving up. Those Luftwaffe pilots were the elite, the best they had left, and they were staring at the tail of a plane they couldn't touch. They were firing their cannons, but the shells were falling short, tumbling back to earth like spent embers. The Mosquito didn't even fire back. It didn't have to. It was on a mission of its own, likely taking the very photographs that would tell our generals where the next Panzer Division was hiding. It was a silent witness, hovering in a realm where the temperature was 60 below zero. Miller crawled over to me, his face a mask of frost and grime. He looked up at the sky and spat a dark stream of tobacco juice into the snow. He asked me what the hell we were looking at. I told him it was a mosquito. He scoffed, his voice a low growl. He said he didn't care if it was a dragon as long as it kept those krauts busy. We had our own problems on the ground. The MG-42s in the pillbox across the clearing had us zeroed in. Every time Tiny tried to shift his weight, a burst of lead would chew up the bark of the trees above us. We were stuck. We were waiting for the word to advance, but advancing meant running into a wall of lead. I looked at the wood of my own rifle, the grain of the American walnut worn smooth by my palms. I thought about the glue they used for the mosquito, casein glue, then later the synthetic stuff. I thought about the craftsmen in England, men just like my father, sitting in shops and bonding layers of wood together to create something that could withstand the pressure of the stratosphere. It was a strange thought to have while people were trying to kill me, but the war makes your mind wander to odd places. It makes you cling to things that make sense. A well-joined seam makes sense. A perfectly balanced blade makes sense. A wooden plane outrunning a jet-powered nightmare makes sense if you believe in the impossible. The German fighters finally peeled away, their fuel light likely blinking red, their engines screaming in protest. They had been humbled. I saw the Mosquito level off, its contrail a straight, defiant line heading west. It had done its job, but for us, the day was just beginning. The sun was hitting the top of the ridge, casting long, distorted shadows across the clearing. I knew that in a few minutes the order would come over the radio. Specs was already hunched over the set, his headset clamped over his wool cap. He gave me a look, the kind of look a man gives you when he knows the news is bad. The brass wanted us to take that pillbox. No air support, no tanks, just us and the cold. I remember the physical sensation of the fear. It wasn't a sharp pain. It was a dull, heavy weight in my stomach, like I'd swallowed a bag of lead shot. My hands were shaking, not just from the cold, but from the realization that I had to lead these boys across 100 yards of open snow. I looked at Tiny. He was checking his magazines, his movements slow and deliberate. He trusted me. That was the hardest part of the whole war. The trust. It's a burden that never leaves you. You carry the lives of those men in your pocket like loose change, and you're terrified you're going to spend them all at once. I stood up just enough to see the pillbox again. The slit was a dark, narrow eye watching us. I could hear the Germans talking, faint guttural sounds drifting over the frozen air. They were confident. Why wouldn't they be? They had the high ground and the heavy guns, but they hadn't seen what I saw. They hadn't seen their own invincible air force get left in the dust by a wooden ghost. I felt a sudden, irrational surge of anger. I was tired of being cold, tired of being scared, and tired of the manuals telling us what was possible. I turned to Miller and told him to get the smoke grenades ready. We weren't going to do it the way the book said. We were going to do it my way. My father used to tell me that when you're working with a difficult piece of timber, you don't fight the grain. You work with it. You find the path of least resistance, and you follow it until the wood gives way. I looked at that clearing. The wind was blowing hard from the east, whipping the snow into white curtains. If we moved with the wind, using the drift as cover, we might just have a chance. It was a gamble, the kind of thing they'd court-martial you for if it failed. But I didn't plan on failing. I looked up one last time, but the Mosquito was gone. Only its fading trail remained, a white scar on the blue face of the sky. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten. We moved out at 0900. The transition from the stillness of the foxhole to the chaos of movement was like a physical blow. Tiny went first, his bar spitting short, controlled bursts to keep their heads down. The sound was deafening in the crisp air. Thud, 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 echoing off the ice-covered rocks. I was right behind him, my boots slipping on the frozen earth. The smell of burnt powder immediately filled my nose, sharp and acidic. We hit the first line of trees and dropped. The German machine gun opened up, a long, continuous rip like someone tearing a giant bedsheet. The bullets hissed past us, snapping the frozen twigs and sending showers of ice down onto our necks. "Specs, stay on my 6!" I yelled over the noise. My voice sounded thin and strange to my own ears. We were moving through a world of white and gray, our white camouflage smocks the only thing keeping us from being perfect targets. I saw Miller throw the first smoke canister. It hissed and sputtered, vomiting a thick, oily cloud of gray-green smoke that the wind immediately grabbed and stretched across the clearing. It wasn't perfect, but it was a veil. We ran. My lungs felt like they were on fire, the cold air searing my throat with every gasp. Every step felt like an eternity. I was waiting for the impact, waiting for the sudden coldness that meant a bullet had found its mark. We reached the base of the ridge just as the smoke started to thin. The pillbox was directly above us now, the concrete cold and indifferent. We were in the blind spot, but we couldn't stay there. I could hear the German gunners frantically reloading, the metallic clatter of the ammo belts. They knew we were close. I looked at Miller. He had a grenade in each hand, his teeth bared in a grimace. This was the moment. There was no plan now, just instinct and the raw will to survive. I thought about that Mosquito pilot miles above us, sitting in his wooden cockpit. He was probably warm, or at least warmer than us. He was probably thinking about his dinner. I just wanted to see tomorrow. The climb up the final 20 feet was a scramble of mud and ice. I used my rifle as a crutch, digging the butt into the frozen dirt. Tiny was suppressing the firing slit, his bar barking until the bolt locked back on an empty chamber. "Changing!" he roared. That was the window. I lunged forward, grabbing a handhold on a jagged piece of rebar. I pulled myself up, my muscles screaming in protest. I saw the muzzle of a Luger poke out from a secondary observation port. I didn't think. I just swung my carbine and fired. The recoil jarred my shoulder, and the pistol vanished. Miller was beside me then, pulling the pins. He cooked them for 2 seconds, 1, 2, and then shoved them through the primary slit. We threw ourselves backward, sliding down the icy slope as the muffled roar of the explosions shook the ground. A plume of black smoke and dust billowed out of the pillbox. Then silence. Not the peaceful silence of the forest, but the heavy, unnatural silence of a tomb. We waited, our hearts hammering against our ribs like trapped birds. No more machine gun fire, no more guttural shouts, just the wind whistling through the trees and the distant rhythmic thud of artillery somewhere miles away. We sat there for a long time, just breathing. Specs was shaking, his hands fumbling with his radio dials. Tiny was reloading his bar, his movements mechanical. We had survived. We had taken the ridge, but the victory felt hollow, as it always did. Every inch of ground we took was paid for in a currency we couldn't afford to lose. I looked up at the sky again. The blue was deepening as the afternoon wore on. I wondered where that Mosquito was now. Maybe it was already back in England, its film being developed in a darkroom, revealing the secrets of the German line. Maybe the pilot was having a drink, laughing about how he'd left those Messerschmitts in the dust. I felt a strange connection to that plane. It was an outsider, just like me. It was made of the wrong stuff, built by people who thought differently, and it survived by going where no one else dared to go. It didn't follow the rules of the metal-clad war. It paved its own path through the ether. My father would have loved that plane. He would have understood the strength of the grain and the resilience of the glue. He would have seen the soul in that wood. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten. Later that evening, after the rest of the company had moved up to secure the position, we found a discarded German newspaper in the ruins of the pillbox. Specs, who knew enough German to get by, translated the headlines for us. There was a small article near the back, a frantic piece of propaganda about the terror mosquito. The German pilots were calling it the wooden ghost. They were frustrated, angry, and terrified. They had the fastest planes, the heaviest cannons, and the most advanced technology, but they couldn't stop a piece of flying furniture. It was a blow to their morale that no bomb could ever deliver. It was the realization that they were being outsmarted, not just outgunned. I remember one specific detail from that report. A Luftwaffe pilot had been interviewed, and he spoke about the Mosquito with a kind of hushed reverence. He said that when he tried to follow it up to 40,000 feet, his canopy began to crack, and his instruments went wild. He said the British plane seemed to just glide away, effortless and silent, like it belonged to the stars, and he was just an intruder. That stuck with me. In a war defined by the grinding of gears and the roar of engines, there was something beautiful about a machine that succeeded through grace and altitude. The weeks that followed were a blur of whiteouts and night patrols. We moved deeper into the heart of the monster, crossing into Germany itself. The landscape changed, but the cold stayed the same. We saw more mosquitoes, sometimes in the twilight, their sleek silhouettes unmistakable. They became a kind of talisman for my squad. Whenever we saw one, we felt a little less alone. Tiny used to say they were watching over us. Miller would just grunt and say they were looking for a place to drop their laundry. But we all felt it. There was a night in February when we were bivouacked in the basement of a bombed-out farmhouse. The roof was gone and we could see the stars. I was sitting by a small, smokeless fire, trying to dry out my socks. I started talking to Miller about the shop in Brooklyn. I told him about the smell of sawdust and the way the sun looked hitting a finished piece of maple. I told him how I'd planned to take over the business after the war. Miller listened, his eyes reflecting the embers. He told me he'd been a mechanic in Detroit. He understood machines, but he didn't understand wood. He asked me why the British didn't just use aluminum like everyone else. I told him that aluminum was scarce, but wood was everywhere. I told him that wood didn't dent. It absorbed the impact. I told him that a mosquito could take a hit that would shrapnel a metal plane, and the pilot could just patch it with a piece of plywood and some glue. Miller nodded slowly. He said it was a hell of a way to fight a war. We sat there in the silence, two men from different worlds, united by a wooden plane and a shared desire to see home again. That was the night I realized that the mosquito wasn't just a weapon. It was a symbol of human ingenuity, a reminder that when you're backed into a corner, you use whatever you have, even if it's just birch and balsa. I think about the men who flew those planes. They didn't have armor plating around their seats. They didn't have self-sealing fuel tanks in the same way the heavy bombers did. They relied on speed and height. It was a lonely kind of courage. Down on the ground, I had my squad. I could reach out and touch Tiny's shoulder. I could hear Miller's snoring. But up there, at 40,000 feet, it was just two men in a wooden box, surrounded by an environment that wanted to kill them as much as the Germans did. One mistake, one leak in the oxygen system, and they were gone. They were pioneers in a dark, frozen frontier. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten. The war ended for me in April of 1945, near a town called Leipzig. I had a piece of shrapnel in my leg and a weariness in my soul that I didn't think would ever go away. When I finally got back to Brooklyn, the city felt strange. It was too loud, too bright, and too full of people who didn't know what it was like to breathe shards of glass in the Ardennes. My father was older, his hands shakier, but the shop was still there. The smell of sawdust was the first thing that made me feel like I was truly home. I didn't talk about the war for a long time. Not to my father, not to the girls I dated, and certainly not to the neighbors. They wouldn't have understood. They wanted stories of glory and clear-cut heroes. They didn't want to hear about the gray-green smoke or the sound of a Luger in an observation port. But most of all, they wouldn't have understood the mosquito. To them, it was just a footnote in a history book. To me, it was the ghost that kept the sky from falling. One afternoon, about 5 years after I got home, I was working on a cabinet for a lady in Queens. I was using a piece of high-grade birch plywood, and as I sanded the edge, that specific smell hit me, the scent of the adhesives and the grain. It took me right back to that ridge in Belgium. I could see the contrails, I could hear the Junkers coughing. I sat down on my workbench and cried for the first time since I'd left Europe. I cried for Tiny, who didn't make it past the Rhine. I cried for Specs, who went back to Philly but was never really the same. And I cried for the sheer, beautiful absurdity of a wooden plane that flew higher than the world. I started researching the mosquito then. I wanted to know everything. I learned about Geoffrey de Havilland and his vision. I learned how they used balsa wood from South America and birch from Canada. I learned how the workers in the furniture factories, men just like my father, were the ones who built the wings. It was a civilian effort turned into a lethal masterpiece. It was a reminder that the skills we have in peace are the very things that save us in war. My woodworking wasn't just a hobby. It was a connection to a lineage of makers who had, in their own way, turned the tide of the conflict. I'm an old man now. My shop is long gone, and my hands are too stiff to hold a chisel. But I still look at the sky. Whenever I see a high-altitude jet leaving a white scar across the blue, I think of that mosquito. I think of the Luftwaffe pilot standing on the ground, staring up in disbelief, wondering how a piece of wood could be so untouchable. I think of the reflection of the sun on that polished fuselage, 40,000 feet up, where the air is thin and the silence is absolute. I'm telling this story now because there aren't many of us left to tell it. Most of the boys from the 2nd Infantry are gone. The sounds of the Merlins and the MG-42s are fading into the static of history. But I want people to know that sometimes the things that shouldn't work are the very things that do. I want them to know that there is strength in the things that grow from the earth, and that sometimes a little bit of imagination and a lot of glue can do more than 1,000 tons of steel. I carried that moment on the ridge with me for over 70 years. It taught me that perspective is everything. From where we stood in the mud, the world was a narrow, violent place. But from 40,000 feet, the world was wide, beautiful, and full of possibility. The Mosquito didn't just take pictures. It gave us a glimpse of a higher plane of existence, a place where the mess of the war didn't seem so final. I hope that wherever those pilots are, they know that a sergeant from Brooklyn was watching them. I hope they know that their wooden bird gave a group of freezing, terrified infantrymen a reason to keep moving. We weren't just fighting for ground. We were fighting for the right to live in a world where things like the Mosquito could exist. A world where you could build a dream out of wood and fly it all the way to the stars. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten. The war is a heavy thing to carry, but the memories of the Mosquito are light. They are like the wood itself, strong, resilient, and surprisingly beautiful. I'm glad I finally spoke about it. It feels like I've finally sanded down the last rough edge of a very long project. I can rest easy now, knowing the story is out there. The sky is clear today. It's a good day for flying. I remember the last time I saw a Mosquito. It was in a museum, years ago. I walked up to it, and when the guard wasn't looking, I reached out and touched the wing. It didn't feel like a weapon. It felt like home. It felt like my father's shop. It felt like survival. And as I stood there, I could swear I heard the faint, distant hum of a Merlin engine, climbing, always climbing, until it was out of reach of everything but the light. That's what I want to leave you with. Don't always believe what the manuals tell you. Sometimes the wood is stronger than the steel. Sometimes the underdog has wings you can't see, and sometimes the most important thing you can do is just keep looking up. Thank you for listening to an old man's memories. It's been a long road, but I'm glad we walked a bit of it together. Take care of each other. We didn't stay in that pillbox for long. The smoke was still curling out of the concrete slit when the orders came to push toward the next tree line. My leg was cramping, a dull throb that felt like a hot wire was being pulled through my calf. But you don't stop. You can't. If you stop in the snow, you become part of the landscape. I remember the sound of Spex's radio. The static was a constant companion, a rhythmic shushing that sounded like the ocean back home in Coney Island. But every now and then, a voice would cut through, frantic and distorted, speaking of movements and coordinates. We were just pieces on a board, moved by men in warm rooms miles away who looked at maps instead of the faces of their soldiers. That afternoon, the clouds began to knit back together, a heavy gray blanket that threatened more snow. We were moving along a ridge that overlooked a valley where the Germans were supposedly massing for a counterthrust. The intelligence had come from one of those Mosquito flights. The brass called it the Blue Room. The photographs taken by the reconnaissance pilots. They'd fly over at altitudes that made the Luftwaffe pilots dizzy, their cameras clicking away, capturing the exact position of every Tiger tank and every fuel depot hidden under the pine needles. I thought about the men in those cockpits. Two guys sitting side by side, no guns to fire back, just their eyes and their lenses. It was a different kind of war for them, but it was just as lonely. I remember Sergeant Gallagher, our platoon leader. He was a man who looked like he'd been carved out of a piece of old hickory. He'd been in the Army since the 30s, a career soldier who didn't have much use for fancy technology. He used to say that if you couldn't kill it with an M1 Garand, it wasn't worth worrying about. But that day, he was staring at a piece of wet paper Spex had handed him. It was a transcript of a report from a Mosquito pilot who'd spotted a Panzer Lehr column only 5 miles from our position. Gallagher looked at the sky, then at the thick woods ahead. He didn't say anything for a long time. He just spat into the snow and told us to double time it to the ravine. The ravine was a death trap, but it was the only way to flank the column. We were moving through the slush, the sound of our own breathing like a steam engine in the quiet of the woods. I could smell the pine oil and the metallic scent of the grease on my carbine. Every time a branch snapped under the weight of the ice, we'd all drop, our hearts hammering against our ribs. It's a strange thing, what happens to your senses in the woods. You start hearing things that aren't there, and you stop seeing the things that are. You become a ghost among ghosts. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten. I remember a moment when we paused under a massive oak. The bark was rough, frozen solid, and I leaned my head against it for just a second. I closed my eyes, and I wasn't in Belgium anymore. I was back in the shop in Brooklyn. My father was there, his apron covered in fine white dust from a piece of cedar he was turning on the lathe. The smell was so vivid, sweet, sharp, and clean. He was showing me how to check the moisture content of the wood. If it's too wet, Frank, it'll warp. If it's too dry, it'll crack. You have to find the balance. You have to listen to what the wood wants to be. I opened my eyes to the sound of Miller's boots crunching the ice. The balance was gone. The world was nothing but cracks and warps now. We reached the edge of the ravine just as the light was beginning to fail. The valley below was a cauldron of mist. And then we heard it. Not the scream of a fighter, but the heavy, low-frequency rumble of Maybach engines. The panzers were moving. They were huge, dark shapes crawling through the fog like prehistoric beasts. We were too small to stop them, just 30 men with rifles and a few anti-tank grenades. But we had the coordinates. Specs was already on the radio, whispering into the handset, his voice trembling with the effort to stay quiet. He was relaying what that Mosquito had seen hours before, confirming that the targets were exactly where the wooden ghost said they would be. The wait for the artillery was the longest 10 minutes of my life. We were lying on the lip of the ravine, the cold seeping into our chests, watching those tanks. I could see the commanders standing in the hatches, their goggles reflecting the dim light. They looked so confident, so untouchable. They didn't know that miles above them, the sky had already betrayed them. They didn't know that a plane made of trees had sealed their fate before they'd even started their engines that morning. When the shells finally started falling, it wasn't a gradual thing. It was an avalanche of steel. The first volley hit the lead tank square on the deck. The explosion was a blinding flash of orange and red that ripped through the gray mist. The sound followed a second later, a physical wall of noise that slapped us in the face. Then came the others. The ravine acted like a megaphone, funneling the sound and the heat upward. We watched as the column was systematically dismantled. It wasn't like the movies. There was no music, no heroic speeches, just the systematic destruction of men and machines by an unseen force. I looked at Tiny. He was gripping his bar so hard his knuckles were white, but he wasn't firing. There was nothing for us to shoot at. We were just witnesses to the math of war. The Mosquito had provided the variables, and the 105mm howitzers were providing the solution. It felt clean, in a way, and that was the most terrifying part. It was a mechanical, detached kind of killing. I wondered if the pilot of that Mosquito ever saw the results of his work. Did he just fly back to his base, hand over his film, and go to the mess hall for a sandwich? Or did he stay awake at night, wondering about the fires he'd started from 40,000 feet? If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten. The fire from the burning tanks turned the mist into a sickly yellow glow. We stayed there for hours, making sure nothing crawled out of that wreckage. The smell of burning rubber and oil was thick enough to taste, a greasy film that coated the back of my throat. It's a smell that stays with you. Even now, if I pass a garage where someone is welding or burning old tires, I'm right back on that ridge, watching the Panzer Lehr die in the fog. Gallagher eventually gave the order to pull back. We weren't needed there anymore. As we trudged back through the woods, the adrenaline began to wear off, replaced by a fatigue that felt like it was in my very marrow. My legs felt like they belonged to someone else. Specs was still carrying that heavy radio, his breath coming in short, ragged bursts. I reached over and took one of the battery packs from his webbing. He didn't say thanks, he just nodded. That's how it was. You didn't need words for the small kindnesses. We found shelter that night in a cellar of what used to be a schoolhouse. The upper floors were gone, just jagged fingers of brick pointing at the stars. We huddled together for warmth, the heat from our bodies the only thing keeping the frost at bay. Miller found a half-burned book in the debris. He couldn't read the German, but he looked at the pictures, drawings of birds and trees. He showed one to me. It was a diagram of a birch tree, the same kind of wood they used for the mosquito's skin. It felt like a sign, or a joke. I couldn't decide which. "Sarge," Specs whispered, his voice cracking. "Do you think they can see us?" "Who?" I asked. "The guys in the Mosquitos. You think they look down and see 30 guys in a cellar?" I looked up at the gaps in the ceiling. The stars were bright and cold. "Maybe," I said, "but I think we're too small. To them, we're just part of the map. I'd like to be on a map," Tiny muttered from the corner. "As long as that map has a road that leads back to Kansas." I didn't sleep much that night. I kept thinking about the construction of the Mosquito. I'd read in a Stars and Stripes article that they used a sandwich construction, 2 layers of birch with a core of balsa wood. Balsa is the lightest wood in the world, soft enough to dent with a fingernail. On its own, it's nothing. But when you bond it between those layers of birch, it becomes incredibly stiff and strong. It's a composite, a union of opposites. I felt like we were becoming like that wood. On our own, we were soft, breakable boys, but the war was bonding us together, layering us with experience and fear and brotherhood until we were something else entirely. We were becoming a composite of the men we used to be and the soldiers we had to be. The next morning, the sun actually broke through the clouds for a few minutes. It was a weak, watery light, but it made the snow sparkle like a field of diamonds. We were moving out again, heading toward a junction called St. Vith. The word was that the Germans were trying to break through there, and we were being sent to plug a gap. We were walking along a paved road for once, the ice crunched under our boots, and that's when we heard it again. That high, thin whine of twin merlins. I looked up, shielding my eyes. There were two of them this time, flying in a loose formation. They were low, maybe only a few thousand feet, their silver-gray bellies gleaming in the sun. They were moving so fast it made your head swim. No metal plane could move like that without vibrating itself to pieces. But the mosquitoes were smooth. They looked like they were being pulled through the air by invisible strings. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten. As they passed over us, one of the pilots tilted his wings. A quick, sharp dip to the left and then the right. A salute. The sound of their engines washed over us. A deep, resonant thrum that vibrated in my chest. For a moment, we all stopped walking. Even Gallagher looked up. We stood there, a bunch of dirty, tired, bearded men in the middle of a frozen road, watching those beautiful wooden birds disappear into the horizon. It was the only time in the whole war I felt like someone was actually on our side. Not the brass, not the politicians, but someone who understood the beauty of the craft. We hit St. Vith 2 days later. It wasn't a battle. It was a meat grinder. The Germans were throwing everything they had left. Paratroopers, heavy tanks, even some of their new jet fighters made a brief appearance. The jets were terrifying. They moved with a predatory speed that made our Mustangs look like they were standing still. I remember seeing a Me-262 streak across the sky, leaving a trail of black smoke. It felt like the future was arriving, and it was made of cold, hard steel and fire. But even then, I remembered the Mosquito. The jet was fast, but it was temperamental. It needed massive runways and constant maintenance. The Mosquito could take off from a grass field and fly across the continent and back. It was the refined past fighting the brutal future. During the height of the shelling at St. Vith, I found myself pinned behind a stone wall with a kid named Henderson. Not tiny, but a replacement we'd picked up a week before. He was crying, a quiet, rhythmic sobbing that he couldn't control. He'd lost his helmet, and his hair was matted with frozen mud. I pulled him close, trying to shield him with my own body. The ground was shaking so hard I thought the earth was going to split open. The smell of sulfur and wet stone was overwhelming. "I want to go home, Sarge," he kept saying. "I don't want to be here." "I know, kid," I told him. "Just breathe. Look at the wall. Focus on the stones. Look how they're put together." I started explaining the masonry to him, how the weight of the top stones held the bottom ones in place, how the mortar had crumbled, but the friction kept it standing. I talked about the physics of the wall until the shelling stopped. It was a trick my father used to use when I was a kid, and I was scared of a thunderstorm. He'd take me into the shop and show me how the joints in a chair worked. He'd make me focus on the structure of things. If you understand how a thing is built, you aren't as afraid of it being destroyed. We survived St. Vith, but Henderson didn't. He caught a piece of shrapnel an hour later while we were moving to a new position. I didn't have time to mourn him. You don't have that luxury. You just move the body out of the way, take his ammo, and keep going. But I kept thinking about that wall. I kept thinking about how everything is just a collection of parts, held together by pressure and intent. The Mosquito was held together by glue. We were held together by each other. There was a technical sergeant I met a few weeks later at a supply depot. He was a guy who worked on the engines for the British squadrons. He told me a story about a Mosquito that had come back from a mission with over 200 holes in it. He said the pilot had flown through a burst of flak that would have shredded an aluminum wing. But because the Mosquito was made of wood, the holes were clean. The structure didn't shatter, it just absorbed the lead. He told me they patched the whole plane in 6 hours using nothing but wood filler and some fabric tape. He laughed and said it was like repairing a hole in a kitchen floor. That stuck with me. The idea of resilience through absorption. We were all like that. We were being riddled with holes. Some you could see, some you couldn't. But we were still flying. We were still moving. We were taking the hits, and we were patching ourselves up with whatever we had on hand. A joke, a cigarette, a memory of home. We were the wooden ghosts of the 2nd Infantry. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten. By the time March rolled around, the air began to change. It wasn't warm, but the bite was gone. The snow turned to a thick, gray slush that made every step a labor of Hercules. We were moving through small German villages now, places that looked like they'd stepped out of a fairy tale. Cobblestone streets, timber-framed houses, flower boxes that were now filled with frozen weeds. It was beautiful and tragic all at once. I saw the craftsmanship in the houses, the way the beams were notched, the way the roofs were pitched. These were people who understood wood. They were the people who had taught the world how to build. And yet, here we were, destroying it all. I remember one house in particular. The front wall had been blown away, revealing a bedroom on the second floor. There was a wardrobe standing there, perfectly intact. It was made of dark cherry wood, polished to a high sheen. I could see the dovetail joints from where I stood in the street. It was a masterpiece of joinery. And in that moment, I hated the war more than I ever had. I didn't hate the Germans in that moment. I hated the waste. I hated that all this skill, all this history, was being reduced to splinters and ash. I walked into that house, despite Gallagher's shouting. I climbed the half-broken stairs and stood in front of that wardrobe. I ran my hand over the wood. It was cold, but it felt alive. I opened the door. Inside were a few dresses, a man's suit, and a small wooden box. I opened the box. It was filled with letters and a small hand-carved bird. A sparrow, maybe. It was carved with such detail, I could see the individual feathers. Whoever made this bird loved the wood. I put the bird in my pocket. I don't know why. Maybe I just wanted to save one small piece of beauty from the wreck. I still have that bird. It's sitting on my nightstand right now. Every time I look at it, I think about the man who carved it. Did he survive the war? Was he one of the men in the pillbox? Or was he just an old man like my father, wondering why the world had gone mad? The mosquito was a weapon, yes. It was a tool of destruction. But it was also a triumph of the same spirit that carved that bird. It was the refusal to let the metal and the machines have the last word. It was the proof that the human hand, working with the gifts of the earth, could still outshine the factory line coldness of the enemy. As we pushed toward the Rhine, the sightings of the mosquitoes became more frequent. They were the harbingers of the end. They were the ones who found the last of the German resistance, the ones who mapped the final path to victory. They flew so high and so fast that the German radar operators began to just ignore them. What was the point of tracking something you couldn't hit? The mosquito had become a psychological weapon. It was the ghost that was always watching, the eye in the sky that never blinked. I remember standing on the banks of the Rhine, looking across at the dark woods of the German heartland. The river was wide and fast, a gray ribbon of cold water. We were waiting for the assault boats. The tension was thick, a physical weight that made it hard to breathe. And then, out of the morning mist, a single mosquito came screaming across the water. It was so low the spray from its props created twin wakes on the surface of the river. It was a PR variant painted in that beautiful Prussian blue that made it almost invisible against the water. It stayed low until it reached the far bank. Then it pulled up into a vertical climb, disappearing into the clouds in seconds. "Show off," Miller muttered. But he was smiling. We all were. That pilot was giving us a front-row seat to the impossible. He was telling us that the way was clear. He was telling us that the ghost had already been there, and the ghost said it was time to go home. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten. Crossing the Rhine was the beginning of the end. The resistance was fierce in spots, but it was the desperation of a dying animal. We saw boys and old men being pressed into service, carrying weapons they didn't know how to use. It was heartbreaking and infuriating. I remember seeing a group of Hitler youth surrendering near a bombed-out factory. They couldn't have been more than 14. One of them was holding a wooden toy plane, a crude model of a fighter. I looked at that toy, and then I looked at the sky. The gap between the dream and the reality was too wide to bridge. I think about the Luftwaffe pilots again, the ones who were stunned by the mosquito. I wonder what they felt when they realized their Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs were obsolete against a plane made of trees. Did they feel cheated? Did they feel like the rules of war had been changed without their consent? Or did they feel a secret admiration for the enemy's audacity? I like to think it was the latter. I like to think that as pilots, as men who understood the sky, they could appreciate the genius of the design even as it defeated them. I met a German pilot after the war, years later, at a veterans reunion in London. He'd flown a Me-262 jet. He was an old man then, with thick glasses and a gentle laugh. We sat in a pub and talked about the Ardennes. He told me that the only plane he truly feared wasn't the Mustang or the Thunderbolt. It was the Mosquito. He said that when he saw a mosquito, He knew that within an hour the bombers would follow. He called it Der hölzerne Bote, the wooden messenger. He said they tried everything to catch it, but it was like trying to catch the wind in a net. He told me about a mission where he'd actually managed to get behind a Mosquito. He said he had his thumb on the cannon trigger, but the Mosquito just ascended. It went up into a realm where his jet engines began to flame out. He watched it go, a silver speck disappearing into the dark blue, and he said he felt a strange sense of peace. He realized then that the war was over. If the British could build something like that, something so perfect and so untouchable, then there was no way for Germany to win. It was a victory of the spirit over the machine. That's a hard thing for people today to understand. We live in a world of plastic and titanium. We think that newer is always better, that metal is always stronger, but sometimes the old ways, the organic ways, have a strength that we've forgotten. The Mosquito was a reminder of that. It was a bridge between the world of my father and the world of the future. It was a wooden ghost that haunted the dreams of a regime built on iron and blood. I still dream about the sound of those Merlins. It's a comforting sound, like a heartbeat. It reminds me that even in the darkest times, there are people who can see beyond the mud and the steel. There are people who can look at a tree and see a wing. There are people who can look at the sky and see a way home. I'm reaching the end of my story, but the memories keep coming, like waves on the shore. I think about Tiny, who's buried in a field in France. I think about Specs, who lived a long life but always jumped when he heard a radio crackle. I think about Miller, who went back to Detroit and never touched a machine again. We were all changed by what we saw. We were all shaped by the war, just like the wood is shaped by the lathe. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten.